My father's side chick came to our house, got into an argument and fought my mother. Little did she know that my 7-year-old only brother had a knife with him. Now guess who is lying in a pool of blood right now after the side chick escaped? The night started with a storm. Not the kind that rattles windows and drenches streets, but the kind that simmers beneath the surface, waiting for the perfect moment to erupt. The kind that lives in whispered suspicions, lingering perfumes on collars, and late-night phone calls that cut off when answered. This storm had been brewing in our house for months, crackling under our family's fragile roof, and on this fateful night, it finally struck. My mother had always been a quiet woman, the kind who chose dignity over confrontation, who swallowed her pain like bitter medicine. But there were limits to even her patience. I had noticed the change in her weeks before, how her hands gripped the edges of the kitchen counter tighter, how her smiles became stretched too thin, how the quiet of our home became suffocating instead of peaceful. It was the weight of betrayal pressing down on her, and tonight, it would all come crashing down. The first sign of trouble was the loud, deliberate knock on the door. Not the uncertain kind of a visitor unsure of their welcome, but the kind that demanded to be answered. I had been in my room, half-heartedly flipping through the pages of a book, when the sound jolted me. My mother, who had been sitting in the living room with my little brother David, stiffened visibly. Her eyes flicked to the door, then to the clock. It was too late for visitors, and I knew, without needing to be told, that she already had a sinking feeling about who it was. David, too young to understand the thick tension in the air, merely swung his legs from his spot on the couch, his small hands clutching a toy car. He had always been sensitive to my mother's emotions, though, and I saw his wide eyes flick to her face, sensing something was wrong. Then came the second knock, sharper, more impatient. My mother exhaled slowly and stood up. She didn't hurry, but there was something deliberate about her steps, something bracing, as if she were walking straight into a storm. I followed, my heart pounding for reasons I couldn't fully articulate. When my mother opened the door, the air in the room seemed to shift, heavy and charged. She was standing there, the woman I had only ever seen in glimpses, in hurried whispers between my parents, in my mother's unshed tears. She wasn't particularly beautiful, not in the way people expect mistresses to be, but she carried herself with a confidence that made her presence imposing. Her dark red lips curled into a smirk, and she leaned against the doorway like she had every right to be there. "Surprised to see me?" she asked, her voice dripping with mockery. My mother didn't flinch, but I saw the slight tightening of her jaw. "What are you doing here?" she asked, her voice calm in a way that only deep anger can be. The woman crossed her arms. "What do you think? I got tired of being a secret. Thought it was time I met the wife properly." A muscle in my mother's cheek twitched. "You've made your point. Now leave." David, still unaware of the depth of what was happening, tugged at my mother's dress. "Mommy? Who is she?" The woman's eyes flicked down to my brother, and something in her expression changed. A flicker of hesitation, maybe even guilt, but it was gone as quickly as it appeared. She straightened and took a step forward. "Your father didn't tell you about me, huh?" she said, directing her words at me this time. "Figures. He likes to keep his worlds separate." My mother's hand shot out, pressing firmly against the woman's shoulder to stop her from stepping inside. I said leave, and just like that, the fragile restraint that had been holding everything together shattered. The woman smacked my mother's hand away, eyes blazing. "Or what? You'll pretend everything's fine, just like you've been doing for months? You think ignoring the truth will make it go away?" My mother took a deep breath, but there was a tremble in her hands now. "I don't need to explain myself to you. This is my home." "Your home?" The woman let out a bitter laugh. "Is it? Because the way your husband spends his nights, it sure doesn't seem like he considers this place home." The words were a slap, and I saw my mother's entire body go rigid. The storm had arrived. I don't know who moved first. Maybe it was my mother. Maybe it was the other woman. But suddenly, they were on each other. The first shove was fueled by months of anger, the first slap by heartbreak, and then it was chaos. They clawed at each other, voices rising in sharp cries of fury, furniture shaking as they stumbled into it. My mother's grief had transformed into pure rage, and the other woman, unwilling to back down, fought just as hard. David screamed, pressing himself against the couch, his tiny hands covering his ears. I wanted to move, to intervene, but I was frozen, watching as the storm of betrayal finally tore through our house. The side chick grabbed a handful of my mother's hair, yanking hard, and my mother let out a cry of pain before retaliating with a slap so loud it echoed through the room. The woman stumbled but caught herself, panting. She lunged, and they crashed into the table, sending a glass shattering onto the floor. David had started crying now, his body shaking with fear. And that was when I saw it, his small hand, reaching down, fingers closing around the knife he had taken from the kitchen earlier when the shouting had started. He didn't fully understand what was happening, but he knew one thing: someone was hurting his mother, and he wouldn't let that happen. The fight raged on, my mother panting, bruises already forming on her arms, the other woman looking just as wild. And David, breathing fast, knuckles white as he held the knife, made a decision that would change everything. He lifted the knife, his tiny body tensed, ready to protect the only person he truly loved. The storm outside howled against the windows, but it was nothing compared to the one inside our home. And none of us, not even David, realized that we had already passed the point of no return. David had always been a quiet child. At 7 years old, he was small for his age, with wide, observant eyes that absorbed the world in a way most kids didn't. While other boys his age ran around carefree, scraping their knees on the pavement and shouting in play, David always seemed still, thoughtful, watching. But tonight, there was no play. Tonight, the world had turned into something ugly, something loud and violent, and David stood frozen in the middle of it. The moment the shouting started, he had been sitting in his favorite spot in the living room, on the thick, blue rug where he usually played with his toy cars. His tiny fingers had been gripping a red race car, rolling it back and forth, letting the sound of the plastic wheels distract him from the arguments he was so used to hearing. But this time was different. This time, the voice arguing with his mother wasn't his father's. David looked up when he heard the sharp slap of a palm hitting wood, the sound of someone's hand slamming against the dining table. His mother's voice, usually strong and commanding, was shaking with fury. "I told you to get out of my house." David turned his head towards the kitchen, his small body tensing. He could see the two women through the doorway, his mother, standing by the sink with her hands balled into fists, and a woman he didn't recognize standing just a few feet away. She was pretty in a way that made David uneasy. Her hair was long and silky, but her eyes were cold, filled with something sharp and cruel. She was dressed in tight clothes that didn't belong in their house, high heels clicking on the floor, long nails tapping against her hip as she crossed her arms. She smirked. "I don't think you get it," the woman said, her voice like honey laced with poison. "I'm not leaving." David didn't understand everything that was happening, but he knew enough. He knew this woman had something to do with the reason his mother cried when she thought no one was watching. He knew she had something to do with why his father came home smelling like a different perfume, why his mother's eyes sometimes looked hollow when she thought no one was looking. And now, she was here, in their home. David's little hands clenched. His mother took a step forward, her face contorted with barely contained rage. "You think you can just walk in here? After everything you've done?" The woman laughed. It wasn't a nice laugh. It was the kind of laugh that made David's stomach twist into knots. "You act like I forced him into my bed," she said, tilting her head. "Your husband came to me willingly, sweetheart. If he really loved you, he wouldn't." The slap came so fast that David barely had time to process it. A sharp, echoing crack filled the air. His mother's hand, now trembling, had left a red mark across the woman's face. For the first time since she walked in, the woman's smirk disappeared. Then, chaos. The woman lunged. David's mother barely had time to react before the two women were entangled, hands grasping at hair, nails clawing at skin. The kitchen exploded into a flurry of movement, bodies colliding against countertops, dishes crashing to the floor. A chair tipped over, landing with a loud thud. David's heart pounded. He had seen his parents argue before, seen his mother cry, seen his father leave and not return until the middle of the night. But he had never seen this. He had never seen his mother in a fight, a real fight, with another woman. And he had never felt this helpless. His breathing became shallow as his small hands balled into fists. He wanted to help. He needed to help. But what could he do? He was just a kid. Then, his eyes fell on the knife. It was sitting on the kitchen counter, just a few feet away from him. A sharp, gleaming thing. Untouched and waiting. It was one of the big knives, the kind his mother used to cut meat. Something inside David clicked into place. He didn't think. He just moved. His tiny feet carried him forward before he even realized what he was doing. He stretched his small arms, his fingers wrapping around the cold handle of the knife. It was heavier than he expected, but he held it tightly, his grip firm. His little chest rose and fell with quick, uneven breaths. He had seen things like this on TV, movies where heroes stopped bad people with weapons. He wasn't supposed to have a knife, he knew that. His mother had always told him never to touch them. But this was different. This woman was hurting his mother, and David needed to stop her. The fight continued in front of him, bodies shifting and struggling. The woman grabbed a handful of his mother's hair, yanking her backward. His mother let out a pained cry, her back colliding with the fridge. David's hands tightened around the knife handle. "Let go of my mommy." His voice was small, but it cut through the noise like a blade. For the first time since the fight started, the woman's eyes flickered toward him. Her expression shifted, annoyance giving way to something else. Something dark. A slow smirk spread across her lips. "Oh, look at you," she said mockingly, still holding on to his mother's hair. "Trying to be a little man?" David's little fingers burned against the knife handle. He didn't like the way she was looking at him. She was looking at him like he was nothing. Like he was just a child. He wasn't just a child. Not right now. Right now, he was the only one who could protect his mother. I said let go. His voice was shaking, but there was steel behind it. The woman only laughed, tugging on his mother's hair even harder, making her gasp. And what are you gonna do, little boy? Stab me? David didn't answer, but he took a step forward. For the first time, the woman's smile faltered. She eyed the knife in his hand, her amusement flickering with something else. Uncertainty. That's right, be scared. His small fingers gripped the handle even tighter, his little knuckles going white. He had never hurt anyone before. He had never even gotten into a real fight. But right now, the only thing that mattered was stopping this woman. His mother's voice broke through the chaos. David, put that down. He hesitated. His mother's face was pale, her chest rising and falling with quick breaths. Even with pain in her eyes, her voice was firm. But she didn't understand. She didn't see what he saw. She didn't understand that he had to do this. The woman, sensing his hesitation, let out a soft chuckle. Even your mommy knows you're too weak to do anything. David felt something inside him snap. Weak. That word had followed him his whole life. He was too little, too quiet, too afraid. But he wasn't afraid now. His hands burned. His heart pounded. And in that moment, nothing else existed. Just the knife, and the enemy in front of him. He didn't hear his mother's next words. He didn't hear anything at all. His body moved on instinct, his small arms raising the blade. And then, he lunged. The world slowed to a crawl. David's little hands were trembling, but his grip on the knife was firm. The weight of it felt strange, unfamiliar, yet oddly natural in that moment. He didn't think about right or wrong. He didn't think about consequences. He only thought about one thing: stopping the woman who was hurting his mother. His feet barely touched the ground as he lunged forward, his tiny frame moving with more determination than he had ever felt before. His mother's screams were distant, muffled beneath the rush of blood pounding in his ears. And then, a sudden blur of motion. The woman, the side chick, had seen him coming at the last second. Her body reacted instinctively, pushing forward, shoving his mother with all her strength. David didn't have time to stop. Where the woman had been standing just a moment ago, his mother was now in her place. David's momentum carried him forward, the knife still aimed straight ahead. The blade plunged into flesh. For a split second, everything stopped. A choked gasp, a sharp intake of breath. Then, David's tiny fingers loosened around the knife handle, his mind struggling to comprehend what had just happened. The kitchen, once filled with shouting, was eerily quiet. His mother was looking down at him, her wide eyes filled with something David didn't understand. Shock, pain, betrayal. The knife was buried deep in her stomach. The realization hit him like a bolt of lightning. He had stabbed his mother. The weight of what he had done crushed him all at once, stealing the air from his lungs. He wanted to let go of the knife, to step back, to undo what had just happened, but he couldn't move. His legs felt frozen in place, his body numb. His mother's lips parted, but no words came out, only a shaky, shallow breath. David wanted to scream, to cry, to say I didn't mean to, I was trying to save you. But the words refused to leave his throat. The side chick, the woman who had caused all of this, stood just a few feet away. For the first time, there was fear in her eyes. She hadn't expected this. She hadn't meant for this to happen. But she didn't stay to help. She didn't kneel down beside his mother. She didn't try to stop the bleeding. She ran. David barely noticed her escape. His entire world had shrunk down to the single horrifying reality in front of him. His mother, slowly sinking to her knees, her hands shakily reaching out as if she wanted to touch his face. He stumbled backward, the sticky warmth of her blood now coating his fingers. His stomach twisted violently. "Mommy?" His voice came out small, broken. His mother wavered, her breath uneven. She tried to smile, tried to reassure him, but the pain in her face made it clear that she knew. She knew this was the end. David dropped the knife. It clattered loudly against the tiled floor, the sound making him flinch. The sight of her blood pooling beneath her made his head spin. His legs felt weak, his entire body shaking as reality crashed down on him all at once. He had wanted to save her. Instead, he had killed her. Tears burned his eyes, but he couldn't blink. He couldn't look away from the growing crimson stain on her dress, from the way her shoulders trembled as she fought to stay upright. She was trying to speak. Her lips moved, forming words that he couldn't hear, couldn't understand. David fell to his knees in front of her, his little hands grabbing onto her arms, desperate to hold onto her, to keep her here. "I'm sorry," he sobbed. "Mommy, I didn't." Her fingers brushed against his cheek, warm and wet with her own blood. "Baby," she finally whispered, her voice barely audible. It's okay." But it wasn't okay. Nothing would ever be okay again. Her eyelids fluttered, her body swaying unsteadily. David clutched her tighter, panic rising in his chest. "No, Mommy, stay awake," he begged. Don't go to sleep. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to. I was trying to help." Her breaths were growing shallower. Her warmth was fading. The terror in David's little heart reached its peak as he felt her weight shift. And then, she collapsed. David screamed. The world around him became a blur of red and shadows as he desperately shook her, his tiny hands pressing against the wound, trying to stop the bleeding, trying to fix what he had done. But nothing he did made a difference. His mother's body had gone still. The house, once filled with the sounds of a struggle, was now filled with a suffocating silence. David sobbed, his small body curled up beside her, shaking uncontrollably. His hands were soaked in her blood, his mind a whirlwind of confusion and horror. The side chick was gone. The fight was over. And David's world had shattered into pieces. The minutes crawled by like hours. David sat on the floor beside his mother's motionless body, his arms wrapped around his knees, rocking back and forth as silent tears streamed down his face. His small chest ached from crying. His hands felt cold despite the warmth of the blood that covered them. He didn't understand how things had gone so wrong. He had just wanted to protect her. He had thought that if he stopped the bad woman, everything would be okay. His mother would be safe. She would smile at him, hug him, tell him he had done a good job. But now, she was gone. And it was his fault. The front door was still open, swaying slightly from the wind outside. The side chick had disappeared into the night, leaving nothing behind except the destruction she had caused. David's mind felt foggy, unable to process what would happen next. Would his father come home and see this? Would the police come? Would they take him away? He wasn't sure how much time had passed before he heard the distant sound of a car engine outside. The crunch of tires on gravel. His heart stopped. It was his father. David's entire body went rigid as he listened to the car door slam shut. Footsteps. Then, a pause. The silence stretched out unbearably before. "What the hell?" His father's voice thundered through the house like a bomb. David flinched, curling in on himself as heavy footsteps rushed toward him. And then his father was there, standing in the doorway. His face contorted in horror as his eyes landed on the blood-soaked floor, on the lifeless body of his wife, on the tiny figure of his son sitting beside her, drenched in crimson. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. Then, his father's voice, hoarse and shaking. "David, what did you do?" David lifted his tear-streaked face, his lip trembling, his entire body shaking. I didn't mean to." His voice was barely a whisper. "I was trying to help." But the look in his father's eyes told him that there was no undoing this. No matter what he said, no matter how much he cried, nothing would ever be the same again. The storm outside had finally settled, but inside, the real storm had just begun. The knife was still in her. David couldn't breathe. The world had collapsed into stillness, a moment stretched into eternity. His small hands, once trembling with determination, were now frozen in horror. The handle of the knife, slick with his mother's blood, protruded from her stomach like a terrible mistake made real. His mother's eyes, those warm, kind eyes that had always held so much love, were filled with something he had never seen before. Not anger, not disappointment, not even pain, shock, disbelief. She stumbled, her breath coming in quick, sharp gasps. One hand weakly reached toward the wound, fingers hovering over the knife but not touching it. Her body seemed to resist the reality of what had just happened, as if refusing to accept that her own son had. No, David shook his head violently. He hadn't meant to. This wasn't supposed to happen. The woman, the other woman, the side chick, she was supposed to be the one lying on the ground, not his mother. His breath hitched as he turned his head wildly, searching for her, but she was gone. The front door hung open, swinging slightly in the wind. She had vanished, disappeared into the night like a phantom leaving destruction in her wake. David barely had time to process that before his mother swayed again. She took a step back, one unsteady, weak step, before her knees buckled. David caught her. He didn't even think. His small arms wrapped around her, struggling to hold her up as she sagged against him. She was heavy, her body pressing down on him, her warmth slowly slipping away. Mommy," he whimpered, his voice cracking. Her lips parted, a faint breath escaping, but no words came. He felt it, the way her body was trembling, the way her heartbeat thudded weakly against him, the way her warmth was already fading. David sobbed, "Mommy, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to, His hands clutched at her dress, stained red now, sticky with the life leaving her. The smell of blood was thick in the air, iron and salt, mixing with the faint scent of the lavender perfume she always wore. The kitchen, the same kitchen where she had made him breakfast that morning, where she had kissed his forehead before sending him off to school, was now a crime scene, a place of death. He squeezed his eyes shut. This wasn't happening. This wasn't real. She was going to be okay. She had to be okay. He just needed to fix it. He needed to take the knife out. Maybe if he pulled it out. His small fingers reached for the handle, but as soon as he moved it even slightly, his mother let out a strangled noise, her whole body convulsing. David jerked his hand back, terrified. No, 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 no. That made it worse. He wasn't helping. What should he do? He should call someone. He should get help. David. His mother's voice was barely a whisper, her breath shallow and uneven. He leaned in closer, tears blurring his vision. Her fingers brushed against his cheek. The touch was weak, shaky. It felt like goodbye. David choked on a sob. No, Mommy, don't go to sleep, he pleaded. Please, She gave him a small, sad smile. It was the same smile she had given him every time he cried over a scraped knee, every time he had nightmares. But now, it was different. Now, it was breaking apart. You're my baby, she murmured. Her eyes fluttered closed. Her body went limp. The warmth in her fingers faded against his skin. And then, nothing. Silence. David froze. His small hand shook as he gently shook her shoulder. Mommy? He whispered. No answer. His breathing hitched. He shook her harder, his tiny fingers digging into her arms. Mommy, wake up, he begged. His voice was rising, panic creeping in, but she wasn't moving. Her chest wasn't rising. She wasn't breathing. David's breath came in short, sharp gasps. His heartbeat pounded so loudly in his ears that it drowned out everything else. He grabbed her face with both hands, pressing his forehead against hers. No, 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 Mommy, please. But she was already gone. The truth slammed into him like a hurricane, stealing the breath from his lungs, drowning him in a wave of horror so deep he thought he might disappear inside it. He had killed her. He had killed his own mother. A scream built in his throat, raw and strangled, but he couldn't let it out. His whole body shook as he curled up against her, his tiny frame folding into itself, desperate to feel her warmth, to pretend she was still there. But she wasn't. She never would be again. David didn't know how long he stayed there. Minutes? Hours? Time had stopped existing. But then, a car engine rumbled outside. A door slammed shut. Heavy footsteps crunched against the gravel. David barely registered it. His body was too numb. His mind too shattered. The front door swung open. The sound of footsteps. And then, a voice. A sharp, horrified voice. What the hell? David flinched, his entire body tensing. He turned his head slowly, his vision blurred by tears. His father stood in the doorway. His face was frozen in a mixture of shock, confusion, and horror. His eyes darted between the bloody scene before him. His wife, lifeless on the floor. His son covered in crimson, the knife gleaming under the dim kitchen light. For a long moment, he didn't move. Then, he took a step forward. His voice was hoarse, shaking. David, what did you do? David couldn't answer. The words wouldn't come. His father's expression shifted. Something dark crept into his eyes. Anger. David shrank back. I didn't mean to, he stammered. His voice was small, barely above a whisper. Heavy footsteps crunched against the gravel. David barely registered it. His body was too numb, his mind too shattered. The front door swung open. The sound of footsteps. And then, a voice. A sharp, horrified voice. What the hell? David flinched, his entire body tensing. He turned his head slowly, his vision blurred by tears. His uncle stood in the doorway. His face was frozen in a mixture of shock, confusion, and horror. His eyes darted between the bloody scene before him. His sister, lifeless on the floor. Her son covered in crimson, the knife gleaming under the dim kitchen light. For a long moment, he didn't move. Then, he took a step forward. His voice was hoarse, shaking. David, what did you do? David couldn't answer. The words wouldn't come. His uncle's expression shifted. Something dark crept into his eyes. Anger. David shrank back. I didn't mean to, he stammered. His voice was small, barely above a whisper.